But now they must compete with archaeologists, who began diving on wrecks and exploring this new world in the late 1950s. The warm, clear conditions attracted a new style of archaeologist with flippers from all over the world, and a pattern of annual expeditions is now firmly established. Dr. Toby Parker, lecturer in Roman archaeology at Bristol University, has spent many seasons excavating ancient wrecks, and he told me what sort of projects were going on this season in the Mediterranean.
Well, apart from activities by amateurs of the various countries fronting the Mediterranean, I know that at Carthage, the British team, which has been responsible for part of the rescue excavation campaign at Carthage, have had a marine contingent in the water who've been helping both with excavation and with survey under the sea. And also the American Institute of Nautical Archaeology has been doing a survey of a classical wreck in Sicily.
When it comes to wrecks throughout the Mediterranean, so many of them have been looted over the centuries, haven't they? I wonder if there are many to be discovered that are in their true and pristine state.
Yes, there's no doubt about this at all, especially in deeper water. I just today received a report of a deep wreck discovered by an undersea exploration for a petrol company in the Canale di Sicilia between Sicily and Africa, which I think is below 500 meters deep.
And this presumably would not be touched?
No, that's untouched and untouchable, more or less.
What sort of material then might come from such a wreck?
Yes, this appears to be a cargo of Athenian wine jars, or possibly oil jars of the 4th century BC, a period of which we know quite a lot about trade from documentary sources, but so far very little from archaeological finds such as ships' cargoes.
And what about the vessel itself?
Well, that would have to wait until another time, many years hence perhaps, when we have the opportunity to get down to that depth and try to find whether anything of the ship is preserved. But it may well be that at deep depths ships are better preserved than they are in shallow water.
The deeper, untouched wrecks of the Mediterranean are becoming more accessible with the help of new technology, much of which is coming from the offshore oil industry. But one doesn't have to travel all the way to the Mediterranean to find a wreck. In recent years, archaeologists in this country have been venturing into the less temperate waters around our coasts to explore, for example, the remnants of the Spanish Armada. The great galleons caught the public interest and the attention of archaeologists like Keith McElroy of St Andrews Institute of Maritime Archaeology.
There's a good deal to be found on such sites. Although the structure has been broken up, one can still relate the remains as they lie on the seabed. These remains can be extensive, include wooden material as well as guns and pottery and other solid artifacts. You can still relate the patterning of this material to the ship as she went down, especially if she went down in some coherent fashion, like striking a reef and then driving forward across an area of seabed, spilling artifacts as she goes along. And the complete collection of such a wreck is a very useful document on subjects such as the provisioning of the Spanish Armada, or the type of trade goods that were being sent out from Europe to the East Indies. And the whole collection, which can be precisely dated, the ship went down on a given day, on a given year, gives a much higher degree of precision in the economic or military deductions you can make about the wrecks than you can get from, say, a cesspit in a town site or archaeology on land in general.
But surely a lot of the material, a lot of the artifacts, must be very badly corroded and very badly bashed about in Atlantic gales over centuries.
One would have thought so, and certainly there are a lot of shipwrecks which occur, not surprisingly, on very exposed and rocky coasts, and there the material tends to be broken and eroded. But even in very exposed situations, like, for example, the Grand Griffin on Fair Isle, which is out in the middle of the North Atlantic, the heavy material, the guns, the cannonballs, the lead musket shot, the metal artifacts, navigational instruments even, cauldrons, this sort of thing, sink very quickly to the bottom. And if they get funneled into a gully or an area of sand, a sand patch or something like that, then they get buried relatively quickly by the sea's movement, and they can be surprisingly well preserved. I mean, you, for example, on Spanish Armada and other sites, navigational dividers used in chart work have been excavated from the seabed, and they can be picked up and actually worked, the hinges open and close, without any conservation or anything at all, because they were quickly buried soon after wrecking.
But there's no denying that conditions are rough for archaeological surveys if you're looking for Armada wrecks off the north and western coasts. The high rise and fall of the tides, fiendishly fast currents, and the constant movement of sediment that changes the shape of the coastline, they're all major obstacles. Under these conditions, one is not going to find complete ships with a cargo intact after 2,000 or even 200 years. But there are less turbulent areas where this sort of find is possible. In estuaries, for example, or in marshy land, which was once part of the seabed. The Graveney boat in Kent was just one such find, a late Saxon vessel which was excavated by the National Maritime Museum and is now lying preserved underwater in a series of great tanks. Basil Greenhill is the director of the National Maritime Museum at Greenwich.
The Graveney find of 1970 is of great interest because it strongly suggests the existence in this country, or perhaps in Middle Europe, of a tradition of boat building at the height of the time of the Scandinavian expansion. She's actually dated fairly firmly in the first half of the 10th century, of a boat building tradition which, although in some ways similar to the Scandinavian, is fundamentally different. It may be that the Graveney boat has provided us with the first substantial evidence of the existence at the time of the height of the Viking raids on this country of an indigenous boat building tradition very different from the Scandinavian one. And the second line of research has been into the minute evidence for what she carried during her lifetime. And one of the interesting things it looks as if she carried was hops. And the particular type of hop which fragments have been found, it looks as if it was a kind that was grown at the time on the Rhine.
The museum's archaeological research unit is still working on the preservation of Graveney boat's timbers, and until they decide how best to preserve and display her, the museum is planning to build a fiberglass replica of the ship. Finds like this in marshy land are going to create a good deal of work for what's known irreverently as mud archaeology. The more sheltered areas on the east and southern coasts are also revealing wrecks in very good condition. Keith McElroy has dived on several of them.
A late 18th century ship came to light as a result of underwater erosion of the western bank of the South Edinburgh Channel, and the Port of London Authority have called in the National Maritime Museum to assist, who in turn have called in the St Andrews Institute of Maritime Archaeology to join their divers in an investigation, and where we had most fantastic problems of 3 or 4 knot currents for 5 out of every 6 hours on site, and extremely low visibility, so that even with torches one could see barely a foot in front of your face. And how one can survey, describe and assess a complete ship when you can only see a square foot of it at a time is a problem which daunts anyone.
One wonders if it's worth it.
That is the point. One has to decide one's priorities, and perhaps a late 18th century merchantman, although with a very substantial and interesting cargo, perhaps that is not worth the massive resources which will be required to investigate it in any responsible manner. When you come back to something like the Mary Rose, which is an absolutely prime site, a warship of a period of transition in naval architecture, and one of the major ships of Henry VIII's navy, one of the earliest navies that the British could put to sea, then I think that's worth almost any amount of resources that we can manage to put into the work.
We're standing on the ramparts of Southsea Castle, and this was the castle built by Henry VIII, and it was here that he stood and watched his flagship, the Mary Rose, turn turtle out there in the Solent. What was that occasion like, Margaret Rule?
Well, I think it must have been pretty dramatic. The whole of the English army were here on Southsea Common under Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk. The King was watching his royal ship sail out into action against the French, who lay in the southeastern corner of the Solent. And there before his very eyes he saw the Mary Rose, which he'd built in 1509, some 36 years before, turn over and sink very, very rapidly, with a loss of all on board save for some couple of dozen sailors. She carried quite a lot of armament, mixed armament, light handguns, iron guns, and some very fine brass cast guns capable of firing heavy shot. And she carried longbowmen, archers. She was a well-armed ship.
And what was the reason for that sudden sinking?
Well, the French, of course, claimed that they sank her. but they said that she was sunk by French gunfire. The English, however, after trying for about 6 weeks to raise her and recover her, salvage her, bring her into shallow water, they then had a court of inquiry, and they decided that she'd sunk because of indiscipline amongst the men. Ship carried the captain, Roger Grenville, the vice admiral, and really very, very experienced sailors and soldiers were on board. And it's just possible that because she was going to fight her in action within a mile and a half of land, they put extra soldiers on board, extra gunners in the castles, and these men in light armour would have contributed a very great deal of extra weight, and may have contributed to her rapid sinking. Certainly her gun ports were open. Her guns were run forward, ready to fire. So with her gun ports open, her guns run forward, she doesn't have to heel very much to begin to take in water through the ports. And then, of course, the whole thing becomes quite dramatic. Water rushes into the open ports, and she heels very quickly and sinks.
Today, the Mary Rose is marked by a wreck buoy just off the mouth of Portsmouth Harbour. When Margaret Rule, the site director, and her archaeologists turn out, they sail a large, twin-hulled platform to the spot with all their equipment. I climbed aboard in a choppy sea to find the diving officer and deputy director of the Mary Rose project, Adrian Barrick, briefing 2 divers who were just about to take some equipment down to the seabed.
You will go down on what will be the bottom end, and I will control the descent from the top on the air tap up here.
The divers with Adrian Barrick were taking down a long, flexible hose, which is fed with air from a huge compressor on the afterdeck.
You then tie on to just a couple of the ropes to hold it there, and we fill the barrel, and we should be okay.
Air pumped into this pipe produces a vacuum cleaner effect at the working end and is used to suck material up from the seabed. What sort of things come up through the pipe?
Only with clay and oyster shells and mud that surrounds the timbers of the ship. Any fines we carefully take out and bring to the surface separately. They don't come up this airlift. This is used simply for moving mud to get at the actual ship's timbers.
So you're making the trenches with this. How much progress can you make with a thing like this?
You could make or dig a very large trench with this in a very short space of time if it was uncontrolled. You could dig a trench probably 2 meters deep by 3 meters square in a matter of half an hour if you weren't careful. And of course, up that in an uncontrolled situation like that, you would get pieces of wood, valuable finds, and other things all going up the airlift, never to be recovered.
Well, how do your divers on the bottom manage to grab the finds before they're sucked away?
It's a matter of keeping your eyes open and going carefully with the airlift, and not digging with the nozzle, but feeding mud to the airlift, and therefore you come across finds in the mud rather than feeding the whole lot up the airlift together.
How many divers have you got working from the platform?
We normally find 6 to 8 is a very good working number to have on the boat, and we operate in 2 shifts, with one shift working until 1 o'clock and then the other boat coming out at midday with another shift of people and change over then, so we have fresh people working through the afternoon.
It's a long day then, isn't it?
It is indeed. It's a 14-hour day normally. We start at 7:30 and go home at 7:30.